Department, including work in the Joint Operations Center during the Gulf War, where he was a briefer in the Air Force Operations Room. He was involved in work on the crises in Bosnia and Kosovo. He's a senior executive officer, which is a civilian grade equivalent to the military rank of lieutenant colonel. For 3 years in the 90s, he was posted to a division called Secretariat and given the job of researching and investigating the UFO phenomenon that mirrored the work done in the U.S. by the Air Force Project Blue Book. That was the project in the 60s. Although most of the cases could be explained as misidentifications of known objects and phenomena, a hard core of sightings defied any conventional explanation. Strong evidence emerged suggesting the presence of structured craft capable of speeds and maneuvers beyond the capability of even the most advanced prototype craft operated by the Royal Air Force or the United States Air Force. Nick's unique access to new data and previous government files convinced him that the UFO phenomenon raised serious defense and national security issues. There were numerous instances where UFOs had been tracked on radar, leading to jets being scrambled. There were also cases with terrifying near misses between UFOs and civilian aircraft. All this led Nick Pope to believe that an extraterrestrial explanation was there for some sightings which he could not rule out. His official investigations into UFOs drew him into other mysteries such as alien abductions, crop circles, and cattle mutilations. Upon leaving the ministry's UFO project, he continues his research and investigations privately now, which is obviously why he's able to speak to us, and is now recognized as a leading researcher into both governmental and phenomena and other aspects of the extraterrestrial controversy. He's done extensive media work, including an appearance on Newsnight, one of the UK's most prestigious serious news programs. He's written for or been featured in most of the UK's national newspapers and been interviewed on numerous radio shows, including The Today Show. He's lectured all around the world, spoken to various academic and military organizations, and has discussed the UFO phenomenon at the Oxford Union, one of the world's foremost debating societies. He has acted as a consultant to various television documentaries. It's my pleasure to welcome Nick Pope.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Cheryl. And I'd also like to thank Steve Bassett and all the people at PRG for putting together such a fantastic event. And perhaps most of all, I'd like to thank all of you for actually coming along. I know I've seen about 3 or 4 people who've come over for England just for this. And I'm sure there are other people who've come from other parts of the world. So I think that's absolutely great. I'd like to start just with some fairly standard disclaimers, if I might. Firstly, as Cheryl alluded, although I still work for the Ministry of Defence, I am no longer officially on their UFO project, so I'm appearing here entirely in a private capacity. I'm not acting in any sense as official spokesperson for these issues. Secondly, although I'm going to allude to some secret and top secret material, that material is now declassified and in the public domain. So tied to that, the other disclaimer or point that I would make is that as this is an open public appearance, clearly the level of this presentation can only be unclassified. But with that little bit of sort of housekeeping in mind, what I'm going to try and do in the 50 minutes or so that I've got is give you not so much my own personal experiences on the UFO project. For those of you that want to attend the workshop that I'm doing tomorrow, what I'm going to do then is focus in on 1991 to 94 and my own tour of duty. I'm going to talk about some of the cases I investigated, and I'm going to try and give you a sort of day-to-day snapshot, as it were, an overview of what it was like to be on that project. What I'm going to do today is I think, I'm going to take it back, and I hope it doesn't come across too much like a history lesson, but I think it's an extremely interesting piece of history. What I'm going to do is give you essentially an account of how the British government got into the UFO business at all. How was our UFO project started? Who started it? Why did they start it? What were the politics of it? Who were the personalities? And you know, how did it evolve into the project? And incidentally, although I'm not on that particular program anymore, unlike Project Blue Book, which closed down in 1969, the UK government's UFO project continues to this very day. And I know Timothy Good and I were interviewed, in fact, by a reporter from a major national newspaper. There's a story going to break about more disclosure of files in the UK very shortly. So there's a lot happening on this. But if I can avoid making a cheap joke at the expense of the last speaker, if we can go back in time a little, what I want to do is sort of tell you how we got into this game. And I think to do that, I just need to go through two little related mysteries that you may well be familiar with, and I'm not going to spend too much time on them. But the first is the so-called Foo Fighter mystery from the Second World War. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the basic story of Foo Fighters, that essentially these were balls of light, or in some cases metallic discs and objects, which appeared to be tracking, not engaging, but just following, tracking, certainly British and American aircraft in bombing raids over Europe during the Second World War. Now, the intriguing thing about this is that although intelligence came at this from the angle of thinking, is this some sort of German secret weapon? After the war, it transpired that German and indeed Japanese pilots had seen these things too, and had made the same assumption in reverse, that this was sort of some sort of allied project. And incidentally, for those people who say, as I've sometimes heard it said, oh, well, these Foo Fighters, they were just little balls of light, weren't they? You know, there was a war going on, there was AAA coming up, you know. Is it surprising that people saw lights? Well, I was reviewing some of the documents recently, and one of them mentioned a bombing raid over Turin, and the object was assessed at being 300 feet in length, and the intelligence people on the air staff sort of referred to it somewhat sarcastically, but I think that there was a little bit of, you know, fear of the unknown behind the comment. There was this marvelous little throwaway remark in one of the covering documents, and it just said, herewith the report concerning the wingless wonder. Now, I want to come forward in time, if I can do that, to the ghost rocket mystery, which also got the British government and military kind of intrigued in these sorts of strange phenomena. And the ghost rocket phenomena is really something that happened in 1946. And this was essentially thought to be some sort of wingless aircraft or a missile, and we didn't come at it from the angle of thinking that this is some sort of extraterrestrial phenomenon. That was not in people's mindsets. What was in people's mindsets is a corporate belief, not in Martians, but a corporate belief in Russians. We thought it was a Soviet secret weapon of some sort, or that they'd somehow made an advance in technology. So, of course, we needed to go and check this out. And these reports were coming in from Scandinavia. But in one particular incident, and this is the intriguing thing, although it turned out to have a fairly mundane cause, the Swedish authorities thought at one stage that they had recovered part of one of these ghost rockets. And what was very interesting, and what I think clearly demonstrates the huge interest in strange phenomena without taking a view on what they are, is just how quickly British intelligence officers actually flew out to Sweden and managed to recover this material. And that's an interesting point in itself, given Swedish neutrality, that we can come in and we can do this, and we can take the material, which we did, and we can bring it back to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, and we can do all sorts of technical analysis on it. And this is exactly what happened. Now, as it transpired, this was an embarrassing mistake, and although somebody may well have witnessed a ghost rocket and may well have witnessed it crash, when they went to what they thought was the crash site, they just picked up little bits of coke, and that's what the chemical analysis turned up. And I don't think there was any suggestion, once the technical specialists had done their work, I don't think there was any speculation that this was anything more exotic. But that in itself is interesting. Now, at this stage, I'd like to introduce you to a character who some of you may have heard of, but he is not really as well known in the US as he is in the UK, and even among the modern generation. It's a name that's sadly been forgotten, but it's the character of R.V. Jones, one of the great British war heroes in terms of science. He was involved really in what you would call counterintelligence. His speciality was in trying to think one step ahead of the Nazi regime, and particularly the Nazi regime scientists. And his job was to try and preempt their scientific achievements, or where he couldn't preempt them, to try and degrade and diminish their effectiveness. And he was involved particularly in work on the V-1 and the V-2 rockets, in trying to counter the threat that they posed to the Allies. He was very much involved in the whole radio beam and radar navigation issue, and he even did some work on trying to develop the intelligence about and then counter the embryonic, thank goodness, German nuclear program. So that's who he is. He was Director of Intelligence. After the war, he was Director of Scientific Intelligence. And in fact, he's probably Britain's foremost skeptic on the UFO phenomenon back in those days of the 50s, which I'm going to come on to, because what I'm really going to try and get across is how there was, once we did start thinking about UFOs, a skeptic versus believer debate going on not amongst the public or in the press, but at the very heart of the British establishment, involving great heroic characters from the Second World War, like R.V. Jones. Now, R.V. Jones, he wrote a book years later called Most Secret War. I don't know how many of you have come across that book. If you haven't, it's well worth reading, just for its stories about the war itself. But tucked away right at the back of that book is an interesting little chapter called Bombs into Saucers. And it actually talks about Foo Fighters and ghost rockets and these sorts of issues. And it's interesting, you know, I mentioned the fact that R.V. Jones's skepticism is, and indeed R.V. Jones himself is probably not that well known. But having said that, for those of you that have read the Condon Report, R.V. Jones is referenced in that, and he's also mentioned in Gerald Haynes's his article on the CIA's influence over the UFO phenomenon. Now, I want to kind of break off from that and just tell again a story, and I apologize, it's difficult coming over from the UK. It's difficult for me to really tell how much of this sort of material you've previously been exposed to. So I apologize if there are those of you in the audience who know some of these stories. You know, I'm just trying to pitch it right, but we'll be far more interactive at the workshop tomorrow. So, you know, for the moment, just bear with me, please. In 1955, a journalist called Dorothy Kilgallen wrote a very interesting article in the Los Angeles Examiner in which she alluded to a UFO crash in the UK. Now, there weren't many details of this in her story, and it was a sort of gossipy piece. But she said in that that her source, who she didn't identify, was a senior British politician at cabinet rank. So essentially, it came from pretty much the top. Now, subsequently, there has been speculation that that particular source was Earl Mountbatten of Burma, you know, who is fairly well known, certainly in the UK in UFO circles, as having been one of the great believers in a truly exotic explanation for UFOs. And it's interesting, you know, Dorothy Kilgallen's piece has, I think, been often dismissed, but an interesting little correlation that few people have really kind of seized upon is that in the book Most Secret War, written by R.V. Jones, the great skeptic, there is mention of a British crash. Now, he doesn't say he believes it, but the story essentially is in that 1946, a farmer in Kent, near a place called Westerham, phoned up, and the call got put through to the air technical intelligence people. And basically, this farmer was furious and said words to the effect of, "Come and take that goddamn contraption of yours off my land." Now, again, interesting how serious these things are taken. You know, you might think, if you thought that UFOs weren't really viewed as an important subject, that they would just file that report away and do nothing. Absolutely not. Just as I mentioned in relation to the ghost rockets in Sweden, you know, when the intelligence people were out to a neutral country and somehow in, you know, circumstances which have still not really fully been explained, managed to recover that material and bring it back to the UK. Again, the technical, the scientific intelligence people raced down to try and find this particular farm and, of course, to try and take possession of this object. Now, the whole story, certainly as the great skeptic R.V. Jones tells it in his book, sort of descends into farce. They didn't find a farmer called Gunyon. They found one called Bunyan, who denied having made the call. They didn't find the farm by turning off at the White Dog pub, but they found a pub called the White Hart. So some of the information, and it's interesting, you know, I'm not going to get into a whole sort of speculative piece about disinformation and things, but it is interesting that in this story, some of the details, whilst not correct, are almost close enough to make you wonder. Now, R.V. Jones dismisses this story out of hand, and indeed, not only does he say he thinks it was a prank, although that doesn't quite sit with my understanding of the way that scientific and technical intelligence people behave, particularly in those dangerous post-war days. Not only does he say it was probably a prank, he kind of says that at one stage he himself was suspected of having played the prank. Again, that's interesting. What makes it even more interesting is that, again, R.V. Jones says, so this is not coming from some UFO believer, this is coming from actually somebody who very much thinks the whole thing is nonsense, then goes on to impart another little bit of information, to say that how this first came to his attention was that General MacArthur's staff in Tokyo had signaled the UK. And again, I'm not going to get into discussions about sources and methods for obvious reasons, but it was interesting that a signal should arrive from General MacArthur's staff, you know, apparently fairly quickly after the Westerham incident, whatever you think the Westerham incident may or may not have been, and it sought urgent confirmation that what they called a Russian flying bomb, again, they were choosing the words carefully and not necessarily buying into anything more exotic. They said, seek urgent confirmation that a Russian flying bomb has crashed in the UK. R.V. Jones said, to his colleague, the other senior director of intelligence on the air staff, he said, "What the heck is this?" And the other director of intelligence, who was an Air Force Air Commodore, said immediately, with no hesitation, "Oh, that'll be the Westerham incident," you know, and proceeded to tell Jones this story. Well, you know, that's interesting, and like I say, what's most interesting about it is that this information comes from one of the most skeptical characters, and one of the most skeptical. It's only a chapter, but it's an interesting chapter on these sorts of things, tucked away at the end of a remarkable book about scientific and technical intelligence in the Second World War. Now, R.V. Jones was a skeptic, but as I mentioned earlier, there were certainly some characters who were very much at the opposite end of the spectrum on this. I mentioned Earl Mountbatten. Another one is Lord Dowding. All great figures of the British military, and indeed in Mountbatten's case, the royal establishment, of course. Now, these characters came to centre stage really in 1950, when there was some enhanced media interest in all this. And never underestimate the power of the media in creating an interest in this, or indeed sometimes in killing an interest, but that's another issue. So you have Dowding and Mountbatten, and the Royal Equerry, Sir Peter Horsley, who Timothy Good may have alluded to. Another senior British establishment figure, but again, like R.V. Jones, somebody whose role in all this, and he really does have the star part here, as I'll come on to say, is Sir Henry Tizard. Now, Tizard, like R.V. Jones, played a great part in the UFO story, the story of the British government's UFO project, but Tizard's UFO connection is less well known. Tizard, again, of course, a great pioneer in the what was at the time, and I'm going back to now the early 40s, the late 30s even, one of the great pioneers of radar technology, one of the great British scientific heroes, and somebody without whom, who knows how the whole course of the Second World War would have panned out without some of these great scientific geniuses who just gave us that advantage in terms of radar. But Sir Henry Tizard, where he joins this particular story, is not before or during the Second World War, but it's after the war, in 1950, when he was chief scientific advisor at the embryonic Ministry of Defence, which was drawn together from the single service ministries like the War Ministry and the Air Ministry, the Admiralty. So in 1950, several things all hit at once, which is usually how something kicks off. There were a lot of national newspaper articles about UFOs in the British media for pretty much the first time. And on the back of that national media coverage, Dowding and Mountbatten, as these two great war heroes and parts of the British establishment, they themselves then pitched in to support a truly exotic, perhaps even extraterrestrial explanation for the UFO phenomenon. And they lobbied by writing some material to the papers themselves, but more than that, they lobbied behind the scenes. And it's not known quite how they interfaced with Sir Henry Tizard in his position as chief scientific advisor. But suffice to say, in 1950, Sir Henry Tizard took the historic decision that the Ministry of Defence and the Air Force in Britain needed formally to get into the UFO business and needed to set up a study into this phenomenon to see, whether there was anything to this. So they set up a group to look into this, And I suppose it's only using the language of the time, but it does seem to me, from a sort of socio-historical point of view, quite the most marvelously named committee that the British government has ever had, the Flying Saucer Working Party, you know. And its terms of reference were essentially to look into the UFO phenomenon, to see whether there was evidence of any potential threat to the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom and our air defense region, and, you know, just basically to try to resolve this mystery for one way and the other. And I have with me a copy of the final report. Interestingly, it's on the Ministry of Defence's website now, which is interesting in itself. The point about that is that unlike some documents where you have a tremendously difficult and bitter debate about whether they are genuine, these documents, there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever about their provenance. They came from the Public Record Office, which is our National Archive, and the Ministry of Defense have put them up as part of a small and select number of documents on its own website. And let me tell you a quick story about that. In the run-up to the Freedom of Information Act, which has to come into force fully across all government departments on 1st of January next year in Britain, we're actually lagging a little behind in that. All government departments have something called the publication scheme, where as part of the Act, you must publish proactively some material where you can do so and where you know that it's going to be in the public interest to do so. So the ministry put these documents up on the website in, I think, November 2001, and I happened to see the statistics for hits in the MOD website, where, as you can imagine, there's all sorts of information about wars and everything, this and that. The UFO documents were by far and away the most popular requested. I think I saw figures for about just the first month they had them up or something. And, well, there was some period of time, apologies if I'm mistelling the period of time, but the figures were that out of 18,000 or so hits within that particular time frame, 15,000 were for the UFO documents. And in fact, both Timothy Good and I have been interviewed in the last couple of days by a reporter from a major British national newspaper, the Sunday Times, which is going to run a story about this, which should be in the papers tomorrow. So it's very interesting that all this is in the public eye. I apologize for digressing there, but I thought that was just a sort of worth doing. Anyway, the Flying Saucer Working Party, which you can read on the MOD website, so I'm not going to go through it line by line, but just to tell you some interesting things about what it did, but perhaps more importantly, what it didn't do. And I think this says something quite interesting about government, and it's not something that I'm going to comment on, but I'll let you draw your own conclusions. Whilst the Flying Saucer Working Party looked at the ghost rocket phenomenon from 1946, which you would expect them to do, there is no mention whatsoever in either the final report, which was classified secret discreet, or indeed in the minutes of the meetings that led up to the final report. And the fascinating thing about that, and I think, I don't want to make a criticism, because I think these were all good people working on this and working in a very difficult environment on a very difficult subject. But the reason that there is no mention of Foo Fighters in this, which you would think is somewhat bizarre, given that there are on file reports of 300 feet long objects trailing aircraft during bombing raids and then disappearing off at high speed. The reason is that when they came to draw up the terms of reference, and when they when they thought about who should sit on this committee, they thought to consult with Fighter Command, but they forgot to consult with Bomber Command. So Bomber Command were never in the loop on this. So of course these reports, which were on the Bomber Command files, never really got fed in to the Flying Saucer Working Party. So you might say that in some senses it was already fatally flawed before it got going, because they were not in a position to consider properly all the data that actually the Royal Air Force had actually amassed on this. Now, again, I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's on the MOD website, but it mentions Kenneth Arnold's sighting. It mentions the death of Mantell. It mentions, of course, Project Sign and Project Grudge. There's no reference whatsoever to Roswell, although there is a reference to what, although it's not actually name-checked, clearly does seem to be Frank Scully's UFO crash claim. And indeed, certainly in here, it just references the whole thing as a hoax. But the R word does not get a mention. In terms of actually getting into the data and actually doing the UFO research, again, it's pretty thin. They really didn't make many efforts to get out there and speak to witnesses. They mention a couple of military cases, a couple of civilian cases, a few things they've picked up from the newspapers, and not much else. Now, why did they do that? Well, one reason might be that they kind of got alongside the Americans on that, and I'll come back to that. I mentioned that they mentioned Project Sign and Project Grudge, but just to wrap up the story here. Oh, and by the way, these documents were classified. I'm sorry, I haven't got slides sorted, but secret, discreet. Discreet is what would now be known as UK US eyes only, i.e. our UFO report draws upon information which may be the property of the United States government and cannot be released without the expressed permission of both the UK and the US. So that's interesting. The other interesting thing about the minutes to the meetings that led up to this final report is that some of these really are classified top secret, and again, there are not too many top secret documents floating around where the provenance is absolutely without question, and these are actually some of them. So I think that's good. The bad news was that at the end of all this, the firm conclusion of the Flying Saucer Working Party was that there was nothing to the UFO phenomenon. It was all misidentifications, hoaxes, delusions, and their recommendation was no further action. 1-0 to the skeptics. However, just another interesting thing, it was called the Flying Saucer Working Party, and yet, when the final report was issued, they'd picked up the American term UFO, which was, of course, I think something which Ruppelt actually coined in Project Blueberg. So we'd moved seamlessly from using the British, well, you know, the old language, to using the Blueberg term for this. That in itself is nothing that's a real clincher, but the words you use, the language you choose, is very important. And I've you know, psychologists will point to the link between thinking and language, and whether it shows a conscious attempt to reflect the American position, or whether it sort of reveals a subconscious influence, I don't know. But again, H. Marshall Chadwell from the CIA's OSI, Office of Scientific Intelligence, he was formally consulted by the British authorities, and indeed attended at least one meeting of the Flying Saucer Working Party. Chadwell, of course, a key figure in the Robertson panel, and H.P. Robertson from Caltech interestingly, a wartime colleague and a very good friend latterly of our great skeptical friend R.V. Jones. What you do when you research these things, it's interesting, you find you can draw a sort of diagram and you can wire up all these names and see how these people link into each other, which is interesting. Now, a very famous UFO document, which I'm sure most people have heard of, is Prime Minister Winston Churchill's 1952 question, when he asked the Air Force, what is all this stuff about UFOs? What does it amount to? What can it mean? Please let me have a report. Now, the response was dismissive. It said, yes, don't worry, we've looked into all this a year or so ago, i.e. the Flying Saucer Working Party. We believe that all of these objects could be explained, not most, all, because their point was that even where there was insufficient data, they said, as the skeptical faction in the Ministry of Defence has always said, that with further data, all cases could be resolved conventionally. Now, they say that out of a skeptical belief, and belief is important in all this. The important thing that is perhaps not generally appreciated is that when Winston Churchill got his answer from the air staff, that was not what caused him to drop the subject. Almost certainly, what caused him to drop the subject was the subsequent one-line reassurance from his great friend Frederick Lindemann, Lord Cherwell, who simply said, I have seen the response on UFOs and I agree. Now, Lindemann was known certainly in government and military and scientific circles simply as the Prof. And it was well known that on any scientific matter whatsoever, Winston Churchill, even when Prime Minister, firstly during the war and secondly in his post-war tour, if ever there was a scientific question that came up, he would look to the Prof and he would say, Prof, what does the Prof think of that? Well, what the Prof thought about UFOs was not a lot. Now, again, politics, personalities, I don't say that anyone would set aside their professionalism for a personal feud, but for what it's worth, R.V. Jones, skeptic, a great protege of Cherwell, Lord Cherwell, Lindemann. Sir Henry Tizard, who had set up the Flying Saucer Working Party, although he and Cherwell had once been friends, they had a massive falling out over a whole series of disagreements. And you know, whether that had anything to do with the decision, whether Cherwell thought, you know, that this would be an opportunity to put one over on Sir Henry Tizard and slap him down, I do not know. I cannot back that up with any documents. I simply throw it into the arena because the more we find out about this, the more it is clear that the politics and the personalities have a bearing on this. But again, Churchill asked the question, he got the skeptical response, and the matter dropped. 2-0 to the skeptics. However, in the final analysis, everything with this is driven not by people's opinions, not by people's studies. You know, what people are actually driven by is events. And from 1952 onwards, there were a series of high-profile UFO sightings in the UK which involved the military. And against the background of the Cold War, again, the position of the Ministry of Defence and the position of the Air Force is, again, look, we do not take a position on the extraterrestrial issue, but if there's anything flying on our airspace, if there's anything out there that's faster than we are, that's more maneuverable than we are, and it just looks better than anything we've got, we can't just ignore that because we think the UFO mystery is all stuff and nonsense and just a story in the newspapers. You have to set aside your belief system about UFOs and the giggle factor, and certainly within government, you have to actually then go where the data take you. So that is essentially how the project was kind of set up, then it was strangled at birth, and then it got resurrected because of all these early 50s cases involving UFOs being seen by the military, involving pilots reporting near misses with these things, and increasingly important, that the thing that really got the military into this, of course, was radar evidence. Not an exact science, but if somebody comes to me with a UFO report and says, even a military person, I was flying my aircraft and this is what I saw, that's fine. But if you simultaneously get the fighter controller saying, yeah, I was looking at the radar screens and we picked up that uncorrelated target, so I scrambled the aircraft on quick reaction alert and we ordered an intercept, and they went up there to try, not to shoot it down, but to try and identify it, to try and take gun camera footage of it, and there is gun camera footage. Certainly it was taken. Whether it survives to this day or not, I don't know, but a lot was taken. And if it proves to be something hostile, to escort it out of UK airspace, if it turns out to be something Soviet. Now, as I say, I ran this particular project from 91 to 94, and tomorrow's workshop will focus on that. But I hope I haven't thrown too many names at you, and I hope I haven't sounded too much like a history professor. But I guess the key message in explaining how the British government and military got drawn in to this UFO project, which, unlike yours, still runs publicly to this day, again, details are on the Ministry of Defence website, is that it's actually right from the Foo Fighters and the Ghost Rockets, through the Flying Saucer Working Party, through my tour of duty, and to this very day. Nothing excites people's interests and passions like UFOs. Belief is important, and belief can be a very powerful thing, and sometimes the dogma at the opposite ends of the belief spectrum, in terms of true believers versus diehard skeptics, can be a little scary. I think, we need to concentrate more on the middle. But throughout that time period, there has been a believer versus skeptic debate raging at the very heart of the British establishment, going through the military, going through the politicians, going through the scientists, involving just about every big name you could think of. So it is a serious subject. I do believe there are serious kind of defense and national security issues here. I don't pretend to have the answers, but I hope I've given you a flavor of how the British government got into this. Thanks very much. Having said that we don't have time for questions, I don't know, is there anyone here who can tell me whether we do or not? Yeah, you do. We do? Okay. If anyone wants to shout anything out, and I do mean shout. Okay, the question relates to the relationship between the UFOs and the crop circles. I can only, of course, there speak to what I did during my tour of duty. I didn't have a formal brief for it, but clearly people, because it was known that I was running a UFO project, would report crop circles to me. And to start off with, we got drawn into some fairly simplistic debates about whether the simple circles could be caused from the downwash from a helicopter's rotor blades. Well, no, it couldn't be. We also got asked, are you testing some sort of exotic space-based energy weapon? Well, if we were, we would probably not be testing it on Farmer Brown's cornfield. So those are the sorts of questions we were asked. All I can say to you there is I think it's an interesting mystery. It's not a matter that I really am a specialist in. So I kind of tracked it, and I kept what we call a watching brief. I don't know if you use that kind of expression, but I just basically kept an eye on it. But that was the extent of my involvement.
Yes. Could you speak about your views about the incident at Rendlesham and the ongoing research and debate? I mean, there's been things on cable TV, you know, the UFO invasion at Rendlesham, and there's been mention in the UFO circles. But in terms of your research,
Okay.
what is your latest?
Okay. Well, Rendlesham Forest incident, which I think most Americans refer to as the Bentwaters incident from December 1980. Certainly it's Britain's best evidenced UFO case, and I'm hoping I'll get into that a lot more in the workshop. In fact, I could do a whole nother lecture on that. But just to kind of keep it tight and give a few other people a chance to come in, my personal take on that and the sort of latest event really is that that's pretty much the other big important historical document to have gone up on the MOD's website, along with the Flying Saucer Working Party. Embarrassingly, I even forget the MOD's website. I think it's mod.gov.uk, but if you search on Ministry of Defence and United Kingdom, you'll find it. The key thing about that, I think, in terms of the evidence, not the speculation, in terms of the evidence, is that for one of the first times, we have documents from the Defence Intelligence staff actually up on the Ministry of Defence website talking about that case. And what the DIS did is that they assessed the radiation readings that Colonel Charles Holt and his team took from the landing site. And the documents from the Defence Intelligence staff certainly made it clear that the scientific and technical intelligence specialists there believed that these readings were higher by a factor of about 10. So there's the evidence. Sitting in the audience here is someone who knows far more about the Bentwaters case than I, Peter Robbins, who unfortunately won't be getting into that because I think he's doing James Forrestal. But, if you catch either myself or more probably have a word with Peter about that case, there is a lot of evidence and more is coming out. And interestingly, through these documentaries, new witnesses are coming forward. And again, witnesses whose credentials are absolutely without doubt. It's not like Roswell, where most of them are now dead. It's like the witnesses coming out now, the moment they come out, half a dozen other people say, hey, I remember him, I was on the same flight as him. So these are not sort of wannabes coming to this. These are people who everyone remembers. They served together. Anyone else?
Do you have any information about the Italian Renato Vesco?
I'm afraid the question is about the Italian Renato Vesto. I'm afraid I don't. I don't know anything at all about that.
He wrote a book called, in English, Intercept But Don't Shoot, I believe in the early 50s or something like that. And it was a very well-documented book about the early...
Okay, his book Intercept But Don't Shoot, it sounds to me like a very good piece of philosophy. One that I would certainly agree with, but I'm afraid I'm not familiar with that work.
There have been in this conference a lot of references to people who have been disappeared in the United States. Do you have that same phenomenon in British, somebody gets exposed to a UFO, something or another, all of a sudden they're poisoned or shot or floated down the river?
Okay, the question relates to anyone getting too close to the UFO reality who then meets an untimely end. I've certainly not come across any evidence or indeed really any claims of that in the United Kingdom, I'm afraid. And I'm afraid I'm out of time with that, but I shall be around at the table all over the weekend and at my workshop. So thank you very much indeed.